Welcome to this edition of the High Strangeness Factor on the Paranormal UK radio network. I am your host, Steve Ward. On each episode of the High Strangeness Factor, while we explore all aspects of the paranormal and the unexplained, we put a special emphasis on the parallels and underlying patterns that lie beneath the surface of all of these mysteries. Today I've got a very special guest. Mack Maloney has written more than 50 novels, including the best-selling Wingman series, as well as 3 nonfiction books, UFOs in Wartime, Beyond Area 51, and Mack Maloney's Haunted Universe. Before writing books full-time, Mack was a sports columnist covering the Boston Red Sox and the Boston Celtics. He was also a public relations supervisor for the General Electric Company. Mack is a native of Boston. He is a graduate of the Suffolk University School of Journalism and earned a graduate degree in film from Emerson College. He's the host of a weekly syndicated radio show, Mack Maloney's Military XFiles, and has worked as a consultant to the U.S. government on anti-terrorist programs. He's also a member of the rock band Sky Club. He's married and presently lives off an island off Newbury, Massachusetts. Mack, welcome to the High Strangeness Factor.
Thanks, Steve. Glad to be here.
So, what I'll ask people is, because I'm always curious, how the heck did you get into this general area of UFOs and the unexplained? Did it start as a young kid, or did it come on later?
Yeah, really, kind of as a young kid. As it turns out, when I was growing up, I was a big science fiction fan, and I just read, every science fiction book I could get my hands on, from like Robert Heinlein and Asimov and Ray Bradbury and those guys. And in our little library where I grew up in the Dorchester part of Boston, the UFO books were in the shelf next to the science fiction books. And I don't know, maybe for that reason, I always kind of connected them in a way. And where, in the publishing world, I can tell you that's not something that people want you to do. But in my mind, they were kind of connected in a way. And so I would read UFO books too. And then I just, kind of like a lot of people, just became fascinated with, exactly what was going on. At the same time, my father was a World War II veteran. He had a lot of military history books around the house, and I would read those too. And that's how I kind of, when I grew up, it kind of came together, military and UFO stuff. So as you mentioned, the show, Mack Maloney's Military X-Files, that's how it all came together. How's that for an answer, Steve?
That's pretty good. Actually, that kind of parallels me, because I was a huge science fiction fan and interested in astronomy and all that stuff. I actually had a solar system map back in the late 50s, early 60s, back long before they tried to demote Pluto, and and long before we knew all the moons that surrounded planets like Jupiter. I think that we only thought there were 12 back then, but it was kind of a natural progression. And I think one day, remember an old TV show called You Asked for It? Yeah, people would write in and they would give them what they wanted, any kind of just anything in the news or whatever. But my buddy of mine came down one day and said that they had a show on flying saucers and real flying saucers, and that went over a town somewhere. And what I think they showed some old footage of maybe it was that Utah sighting or whatever, where you see the kind of it's famous, but you see the white dots during the day, kind of a formation going overhead, and there's a big controversy as to whether or not they're just birds reflecting. But anyway, for a young kid to think that these things could actually be real, and then, of course, as you know, because I'm now a 3-year correspondent on your show, Mack Maloney's Military X-Files. Uh, the real I guess the real trigger was in 1966 and the swamp gas stuff. Do you remember that when
Yeah.
in '66? What were your impressions at the time of Dr. Hynek and the swamp gas and all those that heavy wave of UFO sightings that occurred at that time?
Right. I can remember, really distinctly because before I'd go off to high school in the morning, we would watch they had a news show on in the Boston area, and it was actually they would show the news, and then they would show a couple Three Stooges episodes, and then the news again. So, so I remember that it lasted about a week or so, and as they call it a flap, as they say, and all of a sudden it seems like all the media was just concentrated on what was going on there, and it really looked like they had something going. And then when they come out with the explanation of swamp gas, it was almost like a joke. I can even remember back then thinking, this is a cover up. This is they're trying to mislead us or whatever because swamp gas really, but it really put swamp gas into the vernacular in a way.
Yes, it's been a running joke for a long time. I got to see Dr. Hynek 10 years after the fact. Now, he was still attached, of course, to Project Blue Book when he uttered the infamous words swamp gas. And that was Ann Arbor, Michigan. He was giving some kind of a press conference. And what he explained in his talk 10 years later at a MUFON symposium I saw him at was that he thought some of them might be swamp gas. Even so, that was a stretch because swamp gas, acts in a particular way. But by that time he was kind of apologetic, and he, was kind of laughed off what had happened. There were a lot of great cartoons about it, but by that time he had become one of the good guys and started the Center for UFO Studies in Evanston, Illinois, and had left, Blue Book long behind. What is your impression of Blue Book these days, looking back? Because they just have that new TV show out, which I'm not terribly fond of. But
no, a lot of people are not fond of it. I mean, Blue Book was something that it was just a typical military response to something that they did not want to deal with. So, they gave you this impression that it was some organization the size of NASA, with a lot of people walking around in lab coats and stuff, but really. It was, I think, it was Captain Ruppelt was the first guy. He was in charge, and I think he had, a couple enlisted guys and a secretary. I think at most they had 4 or 5 people. And, what they did was they would explain the explainable ones. People would write in and say, I saw this UFO, it was certain this, time of day and this date and so on. And they'd write back and they'd say, well, Venus was very bright that night. And, that would be kind of like the end of it. But they by design, didn't even look into the cases that they knew were basically unsolvable. So it was lip service. Real quick, the only thing, and we've talked about this on the show before, the only good idea that I ever saw really coming out of that was in the early 50s, there was a UFO sighting over an Air Force base, a U.S. Air Force base in Japan, Haneda Air Force Base, which is now Tokyo International Airport, and it's right near Tokyo Bay. And this UFO was seen by lots of people at this air base, and they determined that it was actually going. It was flying in a search pattern. When someone is lost at sea and they send planes up, they search in checkerboard search patterns. And this UFO seemed to be doing that. So Rupert came up with this idea, hey, listen, why don't we do a study to see if UFOs, act in a manner that would, indicate that there was some kind of intelligence behind it. And his explanation was, his comparison was, if you see a bunch of bees flying around, they're going every which way. There's no real intelligent thought to it. There's no formation. But if you see a bunch of geese flying over your head in a chevron, that's an intelligent way of flying, let's put it that way. And so he wanted to do this study to see, how UFOs, how they act. Are they intelligently controlled, or is it just kind of haphazard? And they wouldn't give him the money. So, to me, that was like the one good idea that he had that I've ever heard of, and they turned him down for that. So, once again, military lip service.
That's what my impression was, that they were never very serious about it. It was just something to appease the public a little bit. I think it was preceded by Project Sign and Project Grudge, and
right.
and then they handed it off to the Condon Committee,
right? Yes,
Colorado
sure.
University, and that was a travesty.
Right.
They intercepted some memos where they were actually talking about how, look, we're not really serious about this, but we have to appear to be serious,
Right.
and yeah, it's just awful. Uh,
Right.
but by all accounts, I've not read Ruppelt's book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects, but by many accounts, it's supposed to be a pretty good book. So that's something I'm going to have
Mm.
to tackle one of these days because
He was an interesting guy, and I wish that they do like a real kind of good biography biopic on him, not this kind of stuff that they have on now, because he was almost like J. Allen Hynek, where it seems like the longer he was involved, the more he became kind of a believer. And I guess that there's actually two endings to his book. One of them is where he's saying these things are real and so on and so forth. And then I think I read once that he went back and changed the ending because his pension was threatened. Who knows what. But you see, no matter what, with him was that he could. I think that the frustration set in for him fairly early, and he knew. His job here was just to kind of tamp this thing down, lip service and so on and so forth. So he wasn't really in a position to do any great, research or scientific investigation or stuff like that, which is really what we need. I mean, we've been talking about this now for decades. I mean, that's what you need to do. You have to do a scientific study on UFOs, just like they do a scientific study on a million different things, and you prove things, and you have real evidence, and so on and so forth, and it passes the criteria of the scientific process. No one has seemed to want to do that. I know it's expensive and all so on and so forth, but we can talk all day, but until someone does that, we're just going to be talking to the wind.
I think Colin Bennett wrote some kind of a bio on Ruppelt, and it's got a really strange name that I can't remember. But one I haven't read yet. He did some interesting books. He did one on George Adamski that was pretty interesting, although strangely enough, he seems to give Adamski, the famous contactee that's supposed to have contacted the Venusian in the desert, seems to give him some credibility. But anyway, I think Bennett's book would be interesting. I was, as you know, really, really disappointed with the Project Blue book. I guess it's History Channel.
Right.
I completely understand, and you as a writer, I know you've pitched shows and so forth, and you know that when Hollywood or whoever gets a hold of these things, they take a lot of artistic license, which is fine by me. I don't, it doesn't have to be the straight, dry scoop.
Mm-hmm.
But man, they just went
Yep.
so far off the deep end. Have you watched any of those?
No, I can't watch them, because I can't watch a lot of the stuff on TV because I feel like I'm working. You know what I mean? I feel like I'm supposed to be taking notes or something. And I agree with you about the History Channel. And I'll tell you real quick, I don't know if we talked about this off air or not, but the History Channel got in touch with me 2 weeks ago. And they wanted to, they were interested in the book that I had written, the first UFO book, UFOs in Wartime. They said that they were doing an episode that had to do with the UFOs in the military, and that they were going to call me the next day. And the funny thing is this is like the fourth time that I've gone through this process, and I actually sent BCC copies to our friend Juan and say, look, this is how this is going to go. Sure enough, they don't call me the next day, and then the following day I get an email from them saying, we're going in another direction. And I think probably what happened in that time was someone actually read UFOs in Wartime and realized that, if you really look at least the anecdotal evidence, there is no there's hardly any. In fact, there's maybe a handful of situations where UFOs have actually displayed some kind of belligerent, intent on human beings. I know there are some, but during World War II with the Foo Fighters and stuff, Foo Fighters would show up, while British, air divisions are bombing the hell out of Berlin or whatever, and they're riding right alongside these airplanes. They weren't shooting at our airplanes. We weren't shooting at them. There's very little evidence that aliens and us have exchanged unfriendly fire, let's say. But this, I can almost guarantee you, that's where this episode of the History Channel is going to bring it. It's going to make it seem like there's this secret war between us and the aliens, and it's just nonsense. But as we were saying, and as we did the show last night, we talked a lot about it. What Hollywood wants is not reality. What they want is conflict, and action, violence, and so on and so forth. So they don't want to be confused with the facts.
Before we get a little more into your books on UFOs and so forth, I know that, as you know, me being on a show for a while, and I know from your background, we both look at John Keel as a real kind of force in the realm of the Fortean, the paranormal, and so forth. And how did you first discover John Keel?
Well, it's funny because I did have a lot of UFO books growing up as a kid, and anything I saw on TV or movies, anything having to do with UFOs, I was on it. I was all over it. But then one day I was just in a used bookstore, and I saw the title, The Mothman Prophecies, and I thought that's such an odd title. What could this be about? So, I bought the book, the hardcover book, for $1, and I read it, and it was really like my first kind of paranormal book, if I can put it that way. And I said, wow, look at. I was like pleasantly surprised at how good of a researcher he was, and how he did not stray into all this kind of crazy noise that we see a lot of these UFO books doing in TV shows. And it was just, I don't want to say scholarly, but it was scholarly in a way that he went about looking into what went on, when the Mothman first showed up. So from that point, I was kind of hooked on that part of things too, But I always kind of held him in higher esteem than a lot of authors of books like that, because I don't know, he was actually a researcher, and he did a good job.
Well, as you know, I've always found him fascinating. I discovered him earlier in some of his articles and so forth. And when I had the book that really just changed my thinking was one he wrote, or at least came out earlier than the Mothman Prophecies, called UFOs Operation Trojan Horse. And he was one of the first guys to recognize that so many of these things seem to be connected. And that was at a time period when, and it still happens today, when people get very territorial and they want to see UFOs and cryptids and other paranormal phenomena as very separate entities. One thing I am curious about. You had me come on the show a little over 3 years ago
Yes.
to talk about Mothman. Now I had
Yes.
I had friended you on Facebook, and because I knew of your Wingman books, which we're going to talk about a little bit later, and so I was just curious if can you even remember why you asked me to go on the show? I just wondered if you'd seen all my posts for the Mothman Festival and that kind of thing, or you may not even remember, but.
Come on, Switch. You know me.
Okay.
I can't remember.
Just curious. But anyway,
I'm going to say I'm sure it was. I'm sure it had something to do when I saw Mothman. And because I had read that John Keel book so many years before, I thought, oh yeah, wow, Mothman. Let's get someone on who knows how to talk about it. And then it turns out that we had kind of had communications years before, and
that's right.
Here we were again. So I probably saw the magic word Mothman, and then kind of drew a line to it.
Well, it was a lot of fun. We did 2 segments that time, and then it was a little bit later on. I had the privilege of coming on as a correspondent virtually every week. So that's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, and thank you for doing that, because as you know, we get a lot of email, and a lot of that email actually goes your way.
Well, that's always good to hear. Maybe before we get into the books, which we will. You want to talk a little bit about the show, the genesis of Mack Maloney's Military XFiles, and maybe there's a whole series of interesting characters that come and go with very interesting nicknames. How did that start? How did you get the idea to do the show?
Well, when UFOs in Wartime came out now about 6 or 7 years ago, I did a lot of radio interviews to promote the book, and one of them was on KGRA. Which at the time was run by our good friend Ray Hobbs, and I did like 2 or 3 interviews with people he knew, and then would branch out to all these other different networks. I wound up doing about 100 interviews in 3 or 4 months, from coast to coast down to who knows what, right? And then one day Ray said, "Listen, we're getting together. We're putting together this kind of round table of UFO people." Where there'd be 4 of us, and we would talk about a particular topic. So I got involved with that. I was like this 1/4 part of this monthly show, and then from there, Ray said, "Why don't you do your own show?" So he and I did a show, he was kind of like the co-host for 2.5 years. And if you think the show was wild now, Switch, you would not believe what it was back then. But then it evolved, and I was on Boston TV for a little while, and at that point, as you know, Pistol Pete, who you know, was the co-host, and then we just kind of settled down to do the weekly show, here we are, 3.5 years. You've been on for 3.5 years, is that what you said?
Let's see, about 3 years last February, I think. So yeah,
wow,
getting there. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, gee, it doesn't seem it, but we have a good time every week, it seems. You know, and we don't stick to. We don't stick to paranormal subjects, 100%. Obviously, there is some stuff that we talk about that has nothing to do with, UFOs and paranormal stuff. But that's why it's good that you're on the show, because you're our foundation. Because you always talk, about especially kind of classic UFO sightings and stuff like that. And people really like that, and I think that they stay tuned. They tune in for your kind of stuff and for interviews that we do with authors and stuff, and they kind of put up with our other nonsense.
Well,
you know what I mean?
The other nonsense is a lot of fun. And my only regret is that people can't hear some of the stuff that goes on behind the scenes, including when technology fails. That's
right.
A lot of fun. But
and as you said, the characters on there. We do. This guy Juan is. We all have stage names, let's say.
Yes.
And he was someone who was on the radio years ago, and he was my IT guy, and I got to know him. And then our other co-host is Commander Cobra, who is someone who's been writing to me for, almost 25 years now.
Oh, I didn't realize it was that long. He was when he was in the military, right?
Right, yeah. And he did a number of tours in Iraq and Kuwait, and and we've known each other for a long time, and he's like someone who, I look at him as kind of like the schoolmaster keeping, Juan and I in line type thing, because he's the voice of authority. And then, we have, Switch, you're on, a lot. And we have, we have Nurse Kayla, we have Megan Reagan, we have a lot of interesting people.
The UFO comedian.
The UFO comedian, the black-eyed kid, and Phil Yebba, the comedian.
No belly button man. I mean, it doesn't get
belly
any better
button
than
man
that.
comes in. Yep, yeah. So none of this is planned out, as you know. This just kind of happens organically. Let's say,
Yeah.
And people like when people comment on the show in general, they just say, they like listening to us because we're all friends. We talk to each other as friends, and that we all know each other, and we kind of do. So,
well, it's kind of weird for me because for me, it's a virtual studio. You guys, have actually seen each other, and
right.
So it'll be fun. We've been talking about getting together one of these days and come out to the East Coast, and that will be a blast.
Yeah. Oh, that would be that would be really crazy and fun.
But
but we also should say that some of the fans that we have, how should I put this? We had one particular fan who kind of fell in love with Juan, I think is the correct way to say it, and flew in from the Midwest and surprised him on the air one night.
That's right.
And so stuff like that. And then 2 weeks ago on a show that's going to come on in about a week, there was a woman on, a friend of ours, Sandy Chang, I can mention her name, and there were indications that she might be, I hate to say this, a Chinese spy, but just happened to have a CIA guy on as our second hour guest, and those two got in an argument whether she was a spy or not. So
that was classic, man. That was
unbelievable.
You can't plan stuff like that. And
no. So stuff like that happens all the time, it seems.
And you have definitely never handed me a script, that's for sure.
There's no script. No.
So
there's no script because someone would have to write it first of all, and that would entail some kind of work. But what do you need a script for? We just turn on, as you know, let's turn on the recorder, hope it works, and off we go.
So let me do my station identification a little bit early now. This is something we need to do because this is almost like being a real radio show, Mac. So.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah. How about that? I want to I want to remind everybody that you are listening to the High Strangeness Factor, copyrighted on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. I'm your host, Steve Ward, and with me today is Mack Maloney, author, uh, musician, radio host, all-around great guy, and
Oh boy.
my boss, so to speak, on the Mack
Okay.
Maloney's Military X-Files. So, so let's get into some of your books. Now, your first UFO-related book was UFOs in Wartime, and I know
Right.
from hearing you, we did on the show we just did recently, you always have to pitch these things, you know. So
hmm
what was the genesis of UFOs in Wartime, and tell us a little bit about the book.
Well, at the time I was under contract to Penguin Books, Berkeley Books, and the way that goes is I was writing kind of military action books for them, and anytime you sign a book contract, the publisher that you sign with, they have a thing called right of first refusal. So, in theory, your next idea, you have to give them a shot at the option of publishing it. So I was out to lunch with my editor in New York, and we were just talking really about a new series of action books or whatever, and I don't even know why, but this idea came up that I'd had for a long time, that UFOs seem to be reported more during wartime than in peacetime, and I've had that idea in my head for a long time, and I always I wonder why, because there are more people flying around up there because there's more airplanes, because it's wartime, or more people looking up, or who knows, So I just happened to mention that to him, and he said, that's not a bad idea for a nonfiction book. Would you want to do a nonfiction book as your next book? And so I said, yeah, sure, until I realized that it's probably 5-6 times more work than writing a fictional book, because you have to research and vet stuff and so on and so forth. So it took longer than I thought it was going to be, but that's what really kind of got me into the game. And a lot of people like that book, because really all it is just, I think it's like 210 different stories of military encounters with UFOs in the 20th century and a little bit before that. So after that, the follow-up book to that was Beyond Area 51, which is basically about all the super secret bases around the world in addition to Area 51. And then the follow-up to that was Mack Maloney's Haunted Universe, which is, as you know, is a collection of all these very, very strange stories that I had accumulated while doing research for the other two books. So those are the 3 nonfiction books that I've done.
The UFOs in Wartime, there's just a lot of fascinating events that took place. You kind of trace the history of a lot of the early UFO stuff.
Right.
I was but always fascinated by and I confuse them sometimes. You had the ghost flyers, you had the scare ships, and the ghost flyers, I think, as well.
Ghost
And
rockets.
yes, ghost rockets, and they are all mysterious, completely unexplained, and
hmm
they all had their own unique characteristics. What
Yep.
were the ones that were flying coming out of northern Sweden? The
Yeah, those
ghost.
those were the Ghost Flyers.
Okay.
That was in the 1932-33, up in the really like the top of the world, up in the very northern reaches of Sweden, the Arctic Circle, and people just started seeing these very unusual, enormous airplanes. They had 8 engines on them. They had a twin boom, meaning 2 tail sections. They had pontoons, as if you would need them to land on the water, but you're basically flying over the frozen tundra. And they were just these enormous planes of no other, no country in the world had these kind of planes. Yet hundreds of people saw them. They would fly at night. They would fly in blizzards. They would fly in formations. There was more than one of them. And then all of a sudden they went away. And, we've talked about this on the show a lot. It was a different kind of UFO people have never really figured out. No one has ever come forward and say, hey, I was part of this secret project, or, Germany or Russia or something. We were flying these enormous planes. They just kind of came and went, vanished.
Well, it's one of those things where so many of these reports, you go back to the mysterious airships around
hmm
97. There were actually several different waves of these airships,
Right.
and these the planes you were just talking about. It's like they were a little bit ahead of our
Hmm.
technology. It wasn't, wasn't crazy ahead, but still,
Right.
it didn't make any sense. Planes with 8 different propellers. Was that it in some
Right.
cases? Uh,
I mean, there's not even planes around. There's been, I don't think there's ever been really a mass manufactured plane that had 8 engines. 8 engines is, in a way, you don't need 8 engines for, as odd as that sounds, but but people saw them with 8 engines, and then going back to, jumping ahead to 1946, the Ghost rockets over the same part of Sweden and Scandinavia. People saw these rockets flying overhead, and there's photographs of them, and they had no idea where they were coming from. A Swedish Air Force pilot actually rode alongside one of them, and his description matches almost exactly the description of a Tomahawk cruise missile, which was technology that really it wasn't even really thought about until the late 70s, early 80s. So as you say, they always seem to be a little bit ahead of their time, and just not of this place. Just they seem to be from a place that is just right next door, universe next door, or something.
or it even kind of hints at we get all the mythology or whatever you want to call it of the hollow earth or the caverns
Hmm.
within the earth. It's almost like you can imagine some
Yes.
secret base in Antarctica or Arctica or the Arctic rather, where some hidden, it conjures up visions of that people talk a lot about a hidden race, a
Hmm.
breakaway civilization. And I don't know if there's any legitimacy to that or not, but I've always found that very intriguing. And
Hmm.
uh, and some of that could explain some of these things. A group of humans split off 1,000 years ago or whatever, developing their own technology, but not the least bit interested in merging with us. There's even a story I think Walter Bosley talked about as a possibility, not a certainty, about the Roswell crash was actually it's my favorite Roswell theory, which may not be true, but I don't know, where
Go ahead.
it's actually they were a breakaway race of humanity that
Oh, wow.
crashed. Yes, and then there was supposed to be
Right.
another one that crashed in Arizona, and we were asked to help them out to get them back to where, and they live underground and are used to it. Anyway,
Right.
it's just as believable or unbelievable as the half a dozen, I think, theories of Roswell.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I said earlier that that thing that kind of bothers me in this whole kind of UFO community is that there's so much noise, so much nonsense out there that people can attribute to anything. And to me that really detracts from go back to this like a scientific approach to UFOs. We had a guest on last night for that show that will air in a couple of weeks, and we were talking about Dulce Mountain in New Mexico, where people have written books, people made movies, so on and so forth, that claims that 50,000 aliens live in Dulce Mountain.
Right.
Well, I can guarantee you that 50,000 aliens do not live in Dulce Mountain. But it's this myth that just keeps being heaped on by people who don't mind just, making stuff up. And it's all that kind of stuff that, in my opinion, gives the whole UFO community kind of like the weirdo factor. People look in and say, "Oh, come on, how can you possibly believe that?"
Well,
So that's the noise that I talk about. I wish a lot of that would go away so we could just take a real kind of
and
serious
there's
look at UFOs.
and you're right. There's so much of it, and these hoaxes simply won't die. You
Right.
you people will come out and say and kind of be whistleblowers, and this person wasn't telling the truth, or they made this up. But then somebody else will come out and say, yes, but what about this? And then the whole
Right.
myth keeps going. There are some of the classics that I don't buy. The Majestic 12, I think.
Right.
I don't buy that. I think the reason was a uh, a Mike Heiser, who you know can decipher Sumerian and is
Hmm.
a linguist, I guess, language expert, has
Okay.
examined some of the Majestic 12 documents, and I couldn't examine anything to determine whether it's true or not. But I think this guy is on the level, and he seems to. He pointed out several things where he thought it was not true. And then there's that Project Serpo where we're supposed to have had an
Right.
exchange with aliens,
Right. Right.
and I wish to hell I could remember the source. You know how hard it is to remember it. But there's somebody came up with there were like 2 or 3 people that were supposed to have been part of this, and one of the guys. I can't remember his name, but he was somebody that was associated with other hoaxes, and
Hmm.
as soon as I heard that, I thought, okay, here we go again,
Here we go.
and people
Right.
write books about it, and it just won't die. Uh,
Right.
so now the Beyond Area 51 is a little bit different.
Hmm.
We of course we all know the I don't know the legends, the mythology of Area 51. So and you went and you looked at other mysterious places around the globe.
Right. True. Yeah. There's a lot of secret bases in the United States. Area 51 is just the one that gets all the press. It's like the most famous top secret base in the world, right? Everyone knows about it. So, but there are other instances, especially out in the Nevada desert there, of very 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 secret places. One of them is Tonopah Test Range up near Reno, Nevada. Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, where this is in our country now, where stuff goes on day after day that you don't hear about. AUTEC is the people have called it the U.S. Navy's Area 51. It's not even in the United States. In fact, it's right in the middle of the Bermuda Triangle. It's on the island of Andros in the Bahamas. So to me that's fascinating that the U.S. Navy built their Area 51 in the Bermuda Triangle, whether it was just a happy accident or what. But that to me is just kind of mind blowing in a way, and all the strange stuff that goes on down there. Then over in the UK, there's a place called Porton Down, which is probably England's Area 51. There's a place in Russia called Kapustin Yar, which is a combination of, let's say, Cape Canaveral in Area 51. Chinese have a number of kind of secret places. And the strange thing about it is that almost every single one of them has some kind of UFO history to it. They all have some kind of UFO history to it. The one that's, the exception is Tonopah Test Range, which is probably one of the most secret places that the U.S. military has, and it has absolutely no UFO history to it. So that in a way, just that the fact that it doesn't have a history of UFO sightings kind of makes it unique in a way. Why them? Why are they? Why are they quote avoiding this place? So Area 51 was an interesting book to do. I learned a lot, and people liked it.
Well, and also you cover some, as you know, one of my main interests in the name of the show, these high strangeness areas, these hot spots where
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of things seem to occur. And you covered something called the M Triangle in Russia,
Right.
which I think that's the only place I've ever read about it was your book about all
Mm-hmm.
the bizarre things that have reported to have happened there.
It's this kind of foresty part of the Ural Mountains out in the middle of nowhere, and for years, people have been reporting all kinds of strange stuff. UFOs, just the beginning of it. They see all kinds of like weird globes in the sky forming patterns and everything. They see strange animals walking around. People, beings that can only be called, like aliens, 10-foot tall people. If you're in the forest and you can sit there in a deep forest, yet you hear cars and traffic going by you. You can't make any phone calls except from this one place that they call the phone box, and it's just this 3 square foot square. If you stand in the middle of that, you can make a phone call anywhere. People go into that place with deadly illnesses. They come out cured. People go in with let's say, troubled minds, and they come out, feeling untroubled. But real quick, the story that really gets it for me is that when the Russian government, after the Soviet Union collapsed, let journalists finally go into this place. It was a military restricted zone before this, but when they finally let reporters in there, this one guy who was he was in the Russian army. He got booted out of the Russian army for medical reasons. Never went to school. Caught on as a journalist for a newspaper in Moscow, and was one of the first to go into the M Triangle. And he went through this transformation where he seemed to be enlightened intellectually, during his time in there. Now, this is a guy who was washed out of the military, the Russian military, and never went to school, just happened to be able to write and be a journalist. When he left the M Triangle after 2 weeks, he was infused with this knowledge of astrophysics and astronomy, and that guy went on to be a cosmonaut. And he says that if I had not gone to the M Triangle, this would not have happened to me. And the strange thing is that we know this because on the expedition that he went in on, there just happened to be a reporter from People magazine went in there too, and they did this story on him and this transformation that happened to this guy. So I think we end the book by saying if there's a heaven on earth, it might be the M Triangle.
Well, that would be one of these places. There are places like that I would love to visit. The M Triangle is one of them, as hard as that would be. And of course, the Skinwalker Ranch, and I do visit one frequently, which called the Point Pleasant, West Virginia, where the Mothman events took place. But of course, I'm the guy that doesn't really experience much of anything, whereas some of my friends have, and I've even been with them in that area, or where they've actually sensed or seen something that I didn't. What about you? Do you have any kind of I don't know, sixth sense, or do you ever pick up anything paranormal, or are you just kind of like me and everything sort of shunt trips?
Yeah, I'm one of the unchosen ones. No, I've never seen a UFO. Never seen a ghost. The closest and we've told this story on the show before, just to show you how these things can be mistaken. We live in an island off of Newbury, Massachusetts, as you said in the intro, and we were down the beach one day, my wife and I, and there's a lot of vast kind of marshes all around us, and we saw these two separate bunch of blinking lights coming right towards us, low to the ground. Blinking is just as you hear UFOs sometimes. The sequences of the amber lights and green lights and red lights, and they're moving very fast. They come right at us, and we just looked at each other. We said, "Holy cow! Here it is. We're going to see UFOs." And they went by us, and what they were medevac helicopters going to the hospital in town. If we hadn't been able to see them a little bit up close, or if we hadn't been able to hear them, to this day I would say, "Oh yeah, I've seen 2 UFOs that happened," so on and so. So these things are your mind for some reason wants to go right to UFO, but this is dramatic. But they were helicopters. Sometimes people see seagulls reflected off the sun. They think those are UFOs, but they're just seagulls. But other people see these things clearly. But like you, I've never seen one. I have a feeling that only some people can see them or are chosen to see them, or for some reason they see them and we don't. But I'm in your group.
Yeah, that's very much John Keel felt that certain people were tuned in. They had latent psychic abilities, and
right, yeah.
Some of the same people that would be prone or able to see a UFO might also be apt to see some kind of a creature or whatever. It used to be in the old days, people like Dr. Hynek and Ted Phillips and so forth thought that people that were repeaters were not believable, so they ignored them. But as time went on, they realized, oh, wait a minute, there are certain people that for whatever reason are tuned in and are more apt to see, one after another.
Right. Yep. I agree. It seems to be that way.
And of course, your most recent book, which I guess is still doing very well on Amazon, Mack Maloney's Haunted Universe, and that covers just about everything.
Right. I had in my office, I've been collecting like weird stories, like almost my entire adult life. It just, if I see some kind of strange story, I'll just cut it out or I'll make a note of it or whatever. And pretty soon I had all kinds of boxes with these just odd stories in them, and then a lot of the stuff research for UFOs in wartime and beyond Area 51. So, I talked to my publisher, and I just threw this idea by him, and he said, yeah, people like that. It's almost like an encyclopedia in a way, but I think it's like more than 400 stories about just very, very strange stuff that has happened around the world over the years. And a lot of the stories are only about 2 or 3 sentences long, and what a lot of people say is, oh, that was great. I read a little bit about it in your book, and I'm going to go research it on my own and so on. So, it's kind of opened eyes of a lot of people, and it's just a fun read. It's one of those things some people can just pick it up, and they don't stop reading them until they're at the end. So. And you're mentioned very prominently in the front part of the book, correct?
Yeah, that's true, and it also has a phenomenal cover. I will say the price of the book is worth the cover, even if you
The cover is very cool.
are like someone like, I won't mention his name, Juan, who seldom reads any of these books, but
Yes, right. Even though he did the foreword, he hasn't read the book yet. So that's the kind of guy that
well,
Juan is.
I guess you don't actually have to do that.
I guess not. No.
We can go anywhere you want. I'm kind of curious about you're a musician, right? And you've got a group, is it a rock group called Sky Club?
Yeah, I hang around with musicians. Let me put it that
Okay.
way.
All right.
I don't have that musician gene, but I've listened to a lot of music, all my life. My grandfather actually ran a record store, and when we would go visit him in the store, he'd let us take one record for free, 145 for free. So I had a lot of records even as a little kid, and but I've always had an interest, and we were able to get this deal. I worked for a record company in London as a promo guy, and got to know a lot of British rock bands. Did public relations for them. Got to know the people who ran the record company really well, Boys Print in London. And so just one day I said, how about if can we get a record contract? So they gave us a record contract. We did this album of cover songs about that goes along with a small science fiction story about a spaceman who's lost on a deserted planet, and he only has the music, the tunes in his iPod to keep him company, to remind him of what life was like back on Earth. So that's what we kind of grouped the songs to kind of tell that story. There's a little comic book that comes with the CD. We had a lot of fun doing it. A lot of really good musicians on it. The saxophone player, Omni Castanel, is Paul McCartney's touring saxophone player. The other guys are all really good studio musicians. So it was a lot of fun to do. I always wanted to do it. And that started Sky Club, and now we're working on a second project. We produced an album for a woman singer in Boston. So it's a lot of fun.
Well, because, as you know, I have connections, and I've heard the songs on there. They're cover songs, but they're really superb. I mean, not all cover songs are great, but in some cases, you absolutely would not detect any difference.
Yeah, we really try to, every song on there kind of tells a story about this guy who, like I say, it gets to the point where he misses his wife so much he actually literally tries to fly home and doesn't make it. His body is discovered a million years later by an alien race, and they recreate his iPod, and that introduces music to them. So that's kind of like the punchline of the story. But we really worked hard to not mock up these songs. Some of them are rearranged differently, but we couldn't. We had to kind of respect the original song, and it was a lot of work, and it took a lot of hours to do it, but we really liked the final project and product. And even now, these days, I listen to them and I say, well, that's not too bad.
Yeah, good stuff. Now, what part do you play in it musically?
I play all the synthesizers.
Okay.
And the thing is that you don't really have to be talented at all to do that. It just, the technology, it's technology driven, and I can set up. I have a bunch of keyboards, and I can set them up in a way that I don't really have to do any. I'm not any kind of impresario on the keyboard or anything. You just kind of play along and add strings and stuff like that to what all these other guys have already recorded. I mean, to show you how much a musician I am, it would take the other guys in the band maybe 2 or 3 hours, to put down their track for a particular song in the studio. It would take me about 3 months to learn my part. And then I would go in last, and I would, put my stuff on top of it, where they could do it in hours. It took me a long time of practice and get it right and stuff. But once again, it was kind of like a labor of love. We had a lot of fun doing it.
Do you have your own equipment, or do you use stuff in the studio?
Yeah, we have our own equipment, but we work out of a place, Bristol Recording Studios in Boston, right near Berklee School of Music. And a lot of it is done on, on computers and on software. But what we got to do, what you do at first is you just go in and you lay down all the basic tracks, the guitar and the bass, and the drums. And once you have that foundation, and you put a tracking vocal on it just to kind of guide people for putting solos on and stuff, and then once that's all mixed down, you put on the final vocals, and voila. But a lot of it.
Are you still there?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, you winked out for just a second. I think we're good.
Okay.
So I've always wanted to do something like that. I'm a huge fan of what they call ambient music.
Yes,
Sometimes
me too.
they'll put it under the general heading of New Age, but it's more aptly described as soundscape or sound atmosphere or whatever. And of course, they use a lot of synthesizers, and they used the original Moog synthesizer way back when they were starting to pioneer some of this. So I love that stuff. And my co-host and my producer Andy Mercer is really good at that. He does a lot of what he calls dark ambient music. So
nice.
You'd probably have a lot of fun talking to him about that sometime. But
I know I really get into ambient music, and another thing that you and I share a passion for is soundtrack music, movie soundtrack. Love movie soundtrack music.
And when did you first? I'm just out of curiosity, and people are going to have to indulge me here if we don't talk strict paranormal. But early on, I had while I can't compose a note of music, I was very tuned into film soundtracks, and I could even detect sometimes certain styles that turned out to be the same composer before I even knew composer names. How early was it that you got? Well, of course you were getting those 45s, and so you're interested. But what about film music and so forth? How soon did that develop?
Yeah, I just can remember stuff like I always loved the soundtracks to westerns.
Oh yeah.
For some reason, they could really you can play a certain note, a certain melody, and it says, "Here's the West." This is the Wild West, and so I always liked those kind of soundtracks. And then what really got me turned on, probably back in the late 70s, that someone gave me a cassette, if you can believe this, a cassette of Ennio Morricone's soundtrack for The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly.
Ah, yes.
And it's just such a fantastic soundtrack. And the thing is that it's one of those soundtracks where you hear that distinctive guitar, and you know what movie it's from, and
right.
And that's what that's what you set out to accomplish. And so Ennio Morricone became like one of my favorite soundtrack artists. I got all his stuff. Thomas Newman is another one. We can go on and on. Everyone but John Williams. I don't care for John Williams at all.
I like some of his stuff, but another great Western composer, of course, was Elmer Bernstein. True Grit, The Magnificent Seven, The Comancheros, just good stuff. But when you talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, there was a place we used to go to up north on vacation where they had a jukebox, and they had the single version, the 45 version of the good, the bad, and the ugly. I played it so many times. I think they wanted to throw me off the island, because I couldn't get enough of it.
It's kind of a mesmerizing soundtrack. You just begin at the first song and go right to the end. And then when you go see the movie, and as it turns out, that movie is like one of my favorite movies of all time, because it's a Italian director,
right,
giving you his interpretation of what a American Western movie should be, and they filmed it in Spain. So it's like all over the place, but it is just such a great story, just such a great ensemble cast, and it's just huge, 3.5-hour bombastic movie. It's just the best.
Yeah. Now we're getting a little short on time, but before we go, we got to talk about the Wingman, and that's the word I first became aware of you. I found the used paperback version of the Adventures of Hawk Hunter in a post-Holocaust world, and this guy is pretty badass. Flies what, an F-15?
F-16.
F-16, and carries a Tommy gun.
He carries an M16 with a banana
M16.
clip on it and a .357 Magnum.
You can tell it's been a while since I've read them, but yes, just great stories, great pot boilers. And how did that come about? How did you meet Hawk Hunter?
Well, I had done the first 2 books I had ever done were actually nonfiction books. One of them was on the Alfred Hitchcock TV show, and one of them was on the Perry Mason TV show. When I started, TV books were like a big deal. You do a history of the show, then you do a capsule review of every episode. So when those two books were finished, my agent said, well, give me some pitch ideas. And I pitched everything. I actually pitched like the history of the Flintstones and stuff like that, just to get a job. And then the last sentence on this letter to him, it said, how about Mad Max and an airplane? Because Mad Max was like the big movie at the time. And that was it. That's the elevator pitch, as we talked about on the show, Switch. Mad Max and an airplane. So that's how just came up with this idea. This pilot, he's a Zen pilot, Zen fighter pilot. He's the best fighter pilot that's ever lived. And the United States basically lost World War III to the Russians sometime in the 80s. And he's been trying like crazy. Oh, here he is calling me right now. He's been trying like crazy to bring the United States back together after they lost in World War III. So I just turned in Wingman 19. And in a million years, I didn't think I'd still be writing them all this time later. But people like them, so why not keep doing it?
Well, they're just a hell of a lot of fun, and I remember discovering them, and I liked them so much. I sent you a fan letter back in the dark ages before I was on the internet, and lo and behold, sometime later, I actually got a response, a nice handwritten response, which just blew me away. So that was very cool. But if people want to just have and of course, Hawk, he has a lot of adventures. There's a kind of a sequel to the Wingman series called Starhawk, right, of a few books. And then it's kind of the third phase is where Hawk is kind of back in his roots. And I don't want to spoil too much for people that, haven't read them. But just briefly, I know you've done all kinds of other series and so forth. You're hardly a one-trick pony when it comes to series books and so forth.
Thank you.
Chopper Ops. Let's see. You've got some single books, standalone books like War Heaven.
Yep, War Heaven and Thunder Valley. Pirate Hunters was another big series of ours. Strike Masters. Basically 3 or 4 books on the same group of special ops guys doing all different kinds of crazy things. That's what I do.
Now, some of those are some of those under pseudonyms. So if people are looking for them under Mack Maloney,
I have 8 pseudonyms. Eight different. 8, yeah, right. And I can't remember them all, but I know one of them is Jack Shane, Bill Kellen, Hunter Kennedy. There's a few more on there. See, there's a Strangeness tales. I'll just go real quick, but if you have a contract for a certain publisher and then you get a contract that overlaps from another publisher, you cannot publish under that name when you go on again. So they have to make up a name for you, for you to have parallel books out on the market, if you see what I mean. So that's where pseudonyms come in. It just helps them in the publishing process, not to get people confused between authors. So I've written under 8 different names, and even I can't remember them all.
Well, I want to become a prolific author someday, so I can make up pseudonyms as well.
Don't do that. I urge you not to do that. Get some. Do something a little more less stressful, let's say.
Okay. Well, listen, we're getting short on time. Please plug anything you want on the way out.
Okay. Well, I will plug Switchblade Steve Ward on Mack Maloney's Military XFiles show. Once a week, we're on the Dark Matter Radio Network. We're on Paranormal UK Network and a bunch of other networks, KCOR in Las Vegas. Just do a Google search for Mack Maloney's Military XFiles show. And Switch is on there at least 20 minutes every episode or every show. Usually you're there with us for the 2 hours. And anything else, that you might want to be interested in, just go to Wingman. Go to MackMaloney.com, MackMaloney.com, and we got everything there, the radio, the Sky Club stuff, and also the books.
And be sure and hit Amazon, type in Mack Maloney, and check out his stuff.
Yes.
So, Mack, I'm gonna thank you for being on the show. I really appreciate it. It was a lot of fun, and I hope you'll come back on again sometime.
Sure, anytime, okay. Steve.
So just stay there. I'm going to do my closeout, and we'll talk a little bit after the show.
Okay, cool.
Okay.
Thanks.
Again, I want to thank Mack Maloney for being on the High Strangeness Factor today, and I'm going to see you, Mack, next week for the taping of the next show.
Yes, yep. Can't wait.
And I also need to thank Irene Allen Block and Mark Johnson. They are our fearless leaders here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network, as well as Andy Mercer, my part-time co-host, my High Strangeness Factor Roundtable member, and most importantly, the producer of this show. I also need to thank Brian Zeller, who composed the original music for the High Strangeness Factor. I can be heard weekly, as we just said, on Mack Maloney's Military X-Files on this same network. And I am Steve Ward, your humble host here on the High Strangeness Factor, a displaced Yank here on the Paranormal UK Radio Network. Thank you for listening. I will see you all again in a fortnight. Take care.